My name is Clara Ashwood, and I am 33 years old. And this is the whole story, the one I've carried quietly for the better part of a decade before finally deciding it deserved to be told in full, start to finish, exactly as it actually happened. 7 years ago, on the evening I received my formal certification in gemology and fine art appraisal, the culmination of nearly 6 long, demanding years of graduate study, apprenticeship, and rigorous exams that fewer than a third of candidates pass on their first attempt. My parents were not in the small conference room where the certifying board held its modest ceremony. They were across town, standing under a tent strung with warm white lights, watching my younger brother Nathaniel cut a wide silk ribbon in front of a crowd of nearly 200 people at the grand opening gala for the second location of Ashwood Bell Auction House, the family business my great-grandfather had founded 91 years earlier as a modest antique furniture and estate liquidation shop. I found out where they were the way I've learned nearly everything important about my family over the years, from a text message sent while I was standing in the hallway outside the ceremony room in a navy dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion. The one detail of that evening I still remember with total clarity, even now, all these years later. My mother wrote, "Darling, we are so proud of you, truly. But you know tonight is Nathaniel's night. The whole town is here. We simply couldn't miss it. We'll celebrate you properly this weekend, I promise." I remember reading that message standing in a fluorescent-lit hallway, my certification folder still warm from the printer in my hands, and feeling something in my chest do the particular, familiar thing it had done so many times throughout my life. Not a sharp break, but a slow, quiet settling, the way a house settles on its foundation over years until one day you notice the door doesn't quite close the way it used to. I want you to notice something in that text message, because it took me a long time to fully name it. My mother managed, in a single sentence, to call this my night, and explain in the same breath exactly why that didn't require her presence. Before I take you into everything that happened after that evening, if you're new to this channel, go ahead and hit subscribe, because these stories exist for anyone who has ever built something extraordinary while the people who were supposed to notice were standing somewhere else entirely, admiring someone else's ribbon cutting. And if you've been with this channel for a while, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. This community has become one of the steadiest, most grounding parts of putting these stories together, and I read every single comment that comes in. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because you need the full 3 decades to understand exactly why I didn't cry that evening in the hallway, and exactly what I chose to build instead.
I grew up in Millbrook Falls, a small New England town known for its covered bridges and its concentration of well-preserved colonial and Federal-era estates, the kind of place where old families held onto old furniture for generations and, eventually called Ashwood and Bell when it came time to appraise, sell, or settle an estate. My great-grandfather, Warren Ashwood, founded the business in 1934 with a single rented storefront and a sharp eye for undervalued furniture that the rest of the region hadn't yet learned to appreciate. By the time my father, Richard, inherited it from his own father in the late 1980s, Ashwood and Bell had grown into the most respected auction house in 3 states, known for its scrupulous authentication process and its long, careful relationships with museums, collectors, and old money estates across New England. I was born first. Nathaniel came 3 years later, and from almost the moment he could hold a conversation with an adult, it became clear he had a particular gift that my father valued above almost anything else in the business: an easy, natural charisma that put nervous estate heirs and skeptical collectors instantly at ease. The kind of presence that could walk a grieving widow through the sale of her late husband's collection without ever once making her feel rushed or reduced to a transaction. My own gifts ran in a different, quieter direction. I was fascinated, from a young age, not by the room full of bidders, but by the objects themselves. How you could tell, by the particular weight and cut of a stone, whether a piece of jewelry was genuinely 18th century or a clever later reproduction. How the specific grain pattern in a mahogany veneer could tell you, with real precision, whether a desk had actually been built in 1790 or assembled a century later from salvaged parts to look older than it was. I don't say any of this to paint my family as villains, because I don't believe that's honest, and I've had a long time to sit with the actual shape of what happened, turning it over carefully, The way I've learned to turn over every piece of evidence in my professional life before drawing any real conclusion from it. My parents were not cruel people, by any measure most people would recognize. They loved both of us, in their own ways, and showed up to school events for both of us without fail. But there is a particular kind of narrowing that happens in a family business built, for generations, around personality and relationships as much as expertise, where the child who lights up a room slowly becomes the presumed face of the company's future, while the child whose gift takes a quieter, more technical shape gets filed, gently but firmly, under the numbers person, a phrase that sounds like a compliment and functions, in practice, almost exactly like an exclusion. I want to tell you about one specific memory from when I was 15 because it's the clearest early snapshot I have of what was quietly being decided in that auction house. My father had begun letting me shadow the firm's senior authentication specialist, an exacting, softly spoken man named Mr. Delacroix, who had trained under my grandfather decades earlier and possessed, by that point, nearly 50 years of accumulated expertise in the specific regional furniture styles Ashwood and Bell handled most often. I spent an entire summer at his side, learning to examine dovetail joints, tool marks, and wood aging patterns with a focus that genuinely surprised him. At the end of that summer, Mr. Delacroix told my father, in front of me, in his precise, unhurried voice, "Richard, I have trained perhaps a dozen young appraisers over my career, and I want you to know, this one has the finest natural eye I've encountered in at least 20 years. You should think seriously about her future here." My father smiled, thanked him warmly, and then, in the very same conversation, turned to me and asked if I could go find Nathaniel, who was 12 at the time, because he wanted to start bringing him along to client consultations, get him comfortable in the room early, the way his grandfather did with me. I found Nathaniel in the break room, uninterested in coming along at all, and I remember standing in that hallway feeling something crack quietly inside me that I didn't yet have language for, the understanding that a future here and the future of this company were, in my father's mind, two entirely separate promises, and only one of them had ever really been extended to me. I want to be fair to my parents here because I think it matters, even now, to acknowledge that this wasn't a household built on obvious cruelty. My mother came to every one of my school science fairs. My father took genuine pride in telling clients his daughter had a real eye for detail, a phrase he used often enough that I sometimes wondered, as a teenager, whether he even noticed how differently it sounded from the way he talked about Nathaniel's future. It is a strange, specific kind of grief to grow up loved and still consistently overlooked in the exact area where you most wanted to be seen. I don't think either of my parents ever set out to build a household where one child's gift was treated as the business's future and the other's was treated as a supporting asset to that future. I think, honestly, they were simply repeating a pattern neither of them had ever been asked to examine, one my father had likely inherited from his own father in turn, the same way certain families pass down height or eye color without anyone ever choosing it on purpose. There's a second memory from that same period I've rarely told anyone outside of my husband, and I want to share it here, because it captures something the Mr. Delacroix story only gestures at. The winter I turned 16, I identified, entirely on my own, a small Georgian-era brooch that had come through the shop as part of a routine estate lot, initially catalogued by a junior associate as costume jewelry worth perhaps $40. Something about the setting caught my attention, and I spent 3 evenings after school researching hallmarks and comparing the stones cut against reference photographs in my father's own library, eventually determining, correctly, that it was an authentic piece from a minor but documented 18th century workshop, worth, once properly authenticated and catalogued, closer to $11,000. I brought my findings to my father, genuinely excited, expecting this to be the moment my expertise finally registered as something more than a hobby. He was pleased, in a distracted sort of way, thanked me, had the piece properly re-authenticated and sold at the correct value, and then, that same week, took Nathaniel, who had just turned 13, to his very first black tie estate consultation, dressed in a small tailored suit, introducing him around the room as the next generation of Ashwood and Bell. Nobody introduced me that way, not that year, not any year after it, even after the brooch, even after a dozen similar discoveries over the following years that quietly, steadily built my reputation among the firm's staff as the most technically gifted appraiser to come through the business in a generation. I pursued formal training in gemology and fine art appraisal specifically because I believed for years that I was preparing myself to eventually take over the authentication side of Ashwood and Bell, modernizing and formalizing what had, for decades, relied heavily on Mr. Delacroix's aging, irreplaceable expertise, and a handful of informal apprenticeships passed down without any real institutional structure behind them. I told my parents this plan explicitly more than once over the years, during a long conversation the summer after the brooch discovery, in a detailed letter I wrote my father during my second year of graduate study, outlining exactly how I hoped to eventually build out a proper in-house authentication department once I'd completed my certification. Each time, my father would respond warmly but vaguely, something like, "That's wonderful, Clara, we're lucky to have you," and then pivot, often within the same conversation, to an update about Nathaniel, a major estate consignment Nathaniel had personally secured, a difficult client relationship Nathaniel had smoothed over, a second location Nathaniel had started scouting even before he'd finished his own business degree. I told myself for a long time that this was simply how conversations in my family naturally moved, that it didn't necessarily mean my own plans weren't being taken seriously. I understand now, with the clarity that only comes much later, that I was protecting a hope I'd already, quietly, stopped believing in. The actual decision, when it finally happened without me in the room, the way most of the significant decisions in my family seemed to. I learned about it during a phone call in the spring of my final year of graduate study, delivered almost as an aside in the middle of an entirely different conversation. "Oh, I should mention," my mother said, "your father's been meeting with our state attorney about restructuring the ownership, and we're going to start transitioning majority control to Nathaniel over the next few years. He's already the face everyone in this town associates with the business, and with the second location opening soon, it just makes sense for him to start building real equity in it now." I asked, carefully, what that meant for my own future role, the plans I'd shared with them explicitly, more than once in detail. There was a pause, and then my mother said, in a voice trying hard to sound reasonable, "Well, darling, you're going to have such a distinguished career of your own, wherever you end up. The business really needs someone who can be the public face of it, someone the old families already trust in the room. You've always been better suited to the technical side, working quietly behind the scenes. I think that's actually a real gift, Clara. I don't want you to hear this as anything less than that. Better suited to the technical side. I want you to sit with that phrase because it took me years to fully understand how much quiet damage a sentence like that can do, precisely because it was delivered as a compliment rather than a dismissal. My mother genuinely believed, I think, that she was honoring my strengths rather than diminishing them. But underneath it was a colder message that took me a long time to name. Your years of study, your explicit stated plans, your demonstrated expertise, none of it created any real claim on this family's future leadership. You'll always be valuable in the back room, so the back room is exactly where you should expect to stay. I remember hanging up that call and sitting in my graduate apartment for a long while afterward, looking at the letter I'd written my father 2 years earlier, still saved in a folder on my laptop, outlining in careful, earnest detail exactly how I hoped to help formalize the firm's authentication practices someday. I understood, sitting there, that the future I'd been quietly building toward for years had just been dissolved by a decision made entirely without me, discussed with an estate attorney before it was ever discussed with the daughter it most directly affected. Some quiet, almost clinical part of my brain, the same part that would eventually make me exceptional at my work, began cataloging the exact language my mother had used, the way I would later catalog evidence in a formal appraisal report, not out of spite, but because some part of me already understood I would need the precision of that memory someday, to make sure I never mistook a lifelong pattern for a single, forgivable incident. I remember, too, calling Beatrice that same evening, still in my program at the time, and her saying gently, "Clara, you've spent your whole life proving your worth to people who decided the verdict before they ever looked at the evidence. At some point, that stops being about you." I didn't fully believe her, not that night. It took me years to understand she was right. I completed my certification the following winter, passing the board examination on my first attempt, an achievement my program director told me placed me among the top handful of candidates the certifying body had seen in nearly a decade. I told my parents the exact date of the ceremony months in advance, mailed them a formal invitation the way I'd learned. By then, verbal reminders alone rarely worked in my family. They said they'd be there. And then, 3 weeks before the ceremony, the gala planning for Nathaniel's new branch location, originally scheduled for the following month, was moved up to accommodate a visiting collector's travel schedule, landing directly on the same evening as my certification ceremony, and my parents, faced with that coincidence, did not hesitate for more than a single brief conversation before choosing the gala over the single most significant professional milestone of my entire life. I stood in that fluorescent-lit hallway that evening, reading the text message about the gala, and I felt the last of something in me finish breaking that had been cracking slowly for nearly 2 decades. I did not cry. I walked back into the small conference room, accepted my certification folder from the board chair in front of a modest audience of perhaps 30 people, and found, among that small crowd, my graduate program advisor, Professor Whitfield, and my closest friend from the certification cohort, a fellow appraiser named Beatrice, both of whom had rearranged their own evenings specifically to be there. I remember the specific sound of my own name being read aloud by the board chair, Clara Ashwood, certified gemologist and fine art appraiser, and turning instinctively, out of nearly 2 decades of habit, toward the small row of guest chairs near the back, half expecting, against every bit of evidence my entire life had ever given me, to see my parents there after all. They weren't. I remember thinking, in the strange, suspended moment of accepting that folder, that I had spent my entire life quietly rehearsing this exact moment with different people watching, and that the version actually happening, 2 empty chairs and all, was somehow both the saddest and the most honest thing that had ever happened to me, because for the first time, I wasn't performing for an audience that had never once fully shown up. I was simply being witnessed completely by the people who actually had. Afterward, Professor Whitfield shook my hand and said, simply, "This is one of the finest certification results I've overseen in my career, Clara. You should be enormously proud." And something about the plainness of that sentence, no qualifiers, no comparisons to anyone else's achievements, undid something in me that I'd been holding together with sheer stubbornness for years. 2 weeks later, I called my parents and told them, calmly, that I needed real distance from the family for a while. My mother cried and said I was making far too much of one unfortunate scheduling coincidence, a framing that treated a pattern spanning my entire childhood as a single isolated incident. My father said, "You've always taken these things harder than you needed to, Clara," a sentence I don't believe he ever once applied to Nathaniel, not in 30 years. I told them both that I loved them and I meant it, and then I stopped answering their calls. 7 years passed. If you've ever gone no contact with family, you know the first year feels like standing on ground that keeps shifting, and then slowly something changes and the silence stops being a wound and starts being solid ground you can actually build on. I moved to Boston, took a position with a well-established independent appraisal firm that served museums, insurers, and private collectors, and threw myself into the work with an intensity that surprised even my own supervisors, authenticating estate jewelry, evaluating fine art provenance, and, over time, developing a specialty in exactly the kind of rigorous, defensible due diligence work that private equity firms and institutional buyers increasingly required before acquiring or investing in businesses built around valuable, hard-to-verify inventory. I want to tell you honestly what that first stretch of years actually felt like from the inside, because I think it matters more than the tidy version. There were mornings I'd catch myself composing a mental update for my father about some small professional milestone before remembering, mid-thought, that there was no longer a version of that conversation available to me. Grief, I learned during that period, doesn't require someone to have died. It just requires a door to have closed that you'd spent your whole life assuming would always, eventually, open back up. But something else was happening simultaneously. Without the constant, low-grade calibration of measuring myself against Nathaniel's easy charm, against my parents' narrow definition of what kind of Ashwood belonged in front of a client, I found myself making decisions based purely on what I actually valued for the first time in my adult life. My supervisor during those early years, a formidable senior appraiser named Margaret Okafor, became something close to the mentor I hadn't realized I was missing, someone who reviewed my authentication reports late into the evening not because she had to, but because she recognized from my very first month that I possessed exactly the rare combination of technical rigor and genuine intellectual curiosity the field desperately needed more of. Margaret used to tell me that the best appraisers weren't the ones who arrived already certain of what they'd find. They were the ones who arrived genuinely willing to be surprised by the evidence, whichever direction it happened to point. I didn't fully understand at the time how directly that lesson would end up applying to my own family someday. I met my husband, Julian, during my 4th year in Boston, an estates and trusts attorney who frequently worked alongside appraisers on complex inheritance matters, someone who, I've since learned, listened all the way through a sentence before responding, a habit I found almost disorienting in its novelty the first several months we knew each other. We married quietly, a small ceremony at a restored 18th century in 2 hours outside the city, followed by dinner with 14 people who actually knew and loved us, exactly the kind of wedding neither of us had to perform for an audience that had never fully shown up before. My parents were not invited. I had made peace by then with what that choice meant and what it cost, and I made it anyway because I had finally learned that a guest list built around people who chose you, actively and without obligation, was worth more than one padded out with people who'd simply always been assumed to belong there. 3 years into our marriage, I left the established firm and started Ashwood Provenance Partners on my own, specializing specifically in independent authentication and due diligence work for private equity firms, family offices, and institutional buyers evaluating acquisitions in the fine art, antiques, and collectible space, precisely the kind of rigorous, defensible verification work that meant asking hard, sometimes unwelcome questions about inventory that businesses had every incentive to present favorably. I built the firm's reputation over 4 years on a simple, unglamorous principle borrowed almost directly from Margaret. An honest appraisal that a buyer could actually trust was worth infinitely more, over the long run, than a favorable one that eventually collapsed under real scrutiny. I want to tell you honestly what those early years of building the firm actually looked like, because I think the polished version of this story skips past the part that shaped who I actually became. The first year was leaner than I'd prepared for. I worked out of a small rented office with a single desk and a second-hand jeweler's loupe I'd bought used because I couldn't yet justify the cost of new equipment. I remember taking a red-eye flight to authenticate a single piece for a client in Chicago because the fee, modest as it was, meant the difference between making payroll for my one part-time assistant that month or not. I learned what it felt like to build a reputation one careful, unglamorous report at a time, with no family name opening doors the way it always had for Nathaniel back in Millbrook Falls. Nobody in my family knew any of this was happening. Not the stretch where I turned down a well-paying but ethically questionable engagement because the client wanted a valuation I couldn't honestly support, a decision that cost the firm nearly a quarter of that year's projected revenue. Not the quiet satisfaction of the first time a major museum called Ashwood Provenance Partners directly, unprompted, specifically because of a reputation I'd built entirely on my own name, separate from my family's. My mother, during that exact period, called twice, mostly to ask whether I'd be attending Nathaniel's engagement party. I never told her what I was building during those years. Some part of me, even then, had already stopped expecting her to ask the right questions, so I'd stopped offering answers she'd never requested. I want to tell you about something that happened about a year before the case that changed everything because I think it explains, better than almost anything else I could say, why I responded the way I eventually did. Ashwood Provenance Partners was retained by a mid-sized private equity fund considering an investment in a family-owned regional auction house outside Providence, structurally similar in almost every way to my own family's business, founded by a grandfather, run for decades on relationships and reputation, with a younger, more charismatic sibling installed as the public face, while an older sister, who'd actually trained formally in authentication, had been quietly steered toward a back office role for years. During my inventory review, I discovered a meaningful discrepancy. Several pieces in the business's flagship collection had been cataloged, likely through simple negligence rather than deliberate fraud, at values well above what a rigorous authentication would actually support, a gap significant enough to materially affect the deal's valuation. I remember calling the business's owner, an anxious man in his 60s, to walk him through my findings, fully expecting the defensive, wounded reaction I'd grown used to in this line of work. Instead, after a long silence, he asked me a single, genuine question. What do I actually do now? Do I fight this, or do I just tell them the truth? I told him, plainly, that the truth, disclosed honestly and proactively, almost always served him better in the long run than a fight that risked the deal collapsing entirely once the buyer's own attorneys eventually found the same discrepancies through litigation. He took that advice, disclosed the corrected values directly to the fund before they discovered it themselves, and the deal closed successfully at a fairly renegotiated price, with the relationship between buyer and seller intact rather than poisoned by a hidden discovery. I thought about that call often in the months that followed, understanding, with a clarity I hadn't expected, that I had built an entire career around exactly the kind of honest, unflinching, non-performative accountability that my own family had never once offered me. The kind that names a real problem clearly without either excusing it completely or using it to permanently define the person responsible. I decided, somewhere in the months after that call, without fully realizing I was deciding it, that if a moment like this ever arrived involving my own family, I wanted to be the version of myself that had shown up for that anxious business owner outside Providence.
Not soft.
Not a pushover. Just honest, rigorous, and willing to let the facts speak clearly, without either rescuing anyone from them or weaponizing them beyond what was fair. About 4 months before the call that changed everything, my office manager brought a new engagement letter to our weekly case review meeting, a mid-sized private equity fund preparing to make a significant minority investment in Ashwood Bell Auction House, requesting an independent third-party authentication and inventory valuation audit of the entire collection before closing. Standard due diligence for a deal of this size involving high-value, difficult-to-verify inventory. I remember the exact physical sensation of seeing my own family's name printed on that engagement letter, the strange, disorienting lurch of a word that had shaped my entire childhood appearing suddenly, stripped of any context I could control, on a professional document sitting on my own desk. I asked my office manager, as evenly as I could manage, for a moment before formally accepting the engagement, and that evening, alone in my office long after the rest of the firm had gone home, I read through the fund's preliminary due diligence materials, understanding immediately how significant this deal was for the family, a genuine infusion of growth capital that would allow Nathaniel to expand the business regionally, contingent entirely on the accuracy of the inventory valuation. Ashwood Bell had submitted to secure the investment. I closed that file that night and sat alone in my office for a long time, staring at my own name on the frosted glass of my office door, understanding that I was now, entirely by coincidence, in a position to determine, through rigorous and honest work, whether the single largest financial opportunity in my family's business's 91-year history would actually close. I spent the following days navigating that knowledge carefully, exactly the way professional responsibility required. I disclosed the conflict formally and immediately to Julian and to the fund's own counsel, and I did not personally conduct the physical inventory examination myself. I recused myself from hands-on authentication work, assigning that portion of the engagement to Margaret, who had joined Ashwood Providence Partners as a senior partner 2 years earlier and had no personal connection to my family whatsoever, while I retained only an oversight and reporting role, reviewing her findings for methodological rigor without ever personally handling or valuing a single piece from my family's collection. I want to be honest that this recusal was, in its own strange way, one of the hardest parts of the entire experience. Knowing the engagement was underway, unable to ask the questions some small, still hurting part of me desperately wanted answered, forcing myself to wait for Margaret's findings the same way any outside party would. I did allow myself exactly one boundary within that recusal, the same one I'd learned to ask for in the drywall case years earlier. I asked Margaret to tell me, privately, if her findings ever escalated toward something that might genuinely threaten the family's ability to complete the deal at all. Not so I could intervene, but simply so I wouldn't be blindsided the way I'd so often been blindsided by this family throughout my life. She agreed, which is how I already had a rough sense, calmly and with real information in hand, of what my father was going to tell me the moment his name appeared on my phone 4 months later. My father called me for the first time in 7 years on a Thursday evening in early autumn. I stared at his name on my screen for several rings before answering, something in my chest doing that same old familiar pressure drop I remembered from my graduate apartment years earlier, layered now with a strange, careful awareness of exactly what I already knew and he almost certainly didn't. Clara. My father's voice sounded older, less commanding than the version I remembered presiding over client consultations for 30 years. It's your father. I know it's been a long time. I know, Dad. I kept my voice level. 7 years is enough time to build real fluency in level. I know we have a great deal to work through, and I truly do, but I need to ask you something first, and I know exactly how that sounds, but I didn't know who else in this world would actually understand what we're facing. There it was. The exact architecture of nearly every conversation I'd ever had with him, an opening gesture toward connection existing almost entirely as scaffolding for the actual request. "What's going on, Dad?" I asked. The story came out slowly, with a particular halting formality of a proud man forced to narrate his own family's vulnerability. A private equity fund was preparing to invest in the business, a deal that would allow Nathaniel to expand regionally, secure the firm's future for another generation, and finally give my father the retirement he'd quietly been hoping for. But the fund's due diligence firm had flagged what the deal attorneys were calling material valuation discrepancies in the collection, discrepancies serious enough that the fund was now threatening to walk away from the deal entirely unless the family could either substantiate the original valuations or accept a significantly reduced offer. "We need real expertise, Clara," my father said, his voice cracking in a way that, after 33 years of practice, I still couldn't fully separate from wounded pride dressed up as vulnerability. "Nathaniel's people, they're good with clients, but nobody on our side actually has the authentication background to push back on these findings properly. I need someone who can go toe-to-toe with whoever's conducting this audit. And Clara, I know how this is going to sound, given everything, given how things have been between us, but you're the finest appraiser this family has ever produced. I should have said that to you years ago instead of only realizing it now. I need you to represent us in this." I sat with that request for a long moment, in my own office, the very engagement he was describing already 3 months underway down the hall, in Margaret's careful hands rather than mine. "Dad," I said carefully, "I need to tell you something important before we go any further, and I need you to really hear it. I already know about this. My firm is the one conducting your due diligence audit. I've known for 4 months. I am not personally examining your inventory. I recused myself from hands-on work the moment I recognized the business name, because there's a direct, irreconcilable conflict of interest, and I need you to understand that clearly before we say anything else." There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I genuinely wondered if the call had dropped. "You've known this whole time," my father finally said, his voice small. "And you didn't call us." And there it was. Even sitting inside a genuine financial crisis of the family's own making, the thing my father reached for first wasn't any real curiosity about what my firm had actually found or how serious it truly was. It was hurt that I hadn't reached out faster. "Dad," I said, and for the first time in the whole call, I let something into my voice beyond flat calm. Not anger, just plain truth. "I found out about this deal from an engagement letter on my own desk. You found out I'd passed my certification from a text message I sent you the following morning because neither of you called to ask how the ceremony had gone. I think we're square on the not reaching out fast enough front." There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I genuinely wondered if he'd hung up. When he finally spoke again, his voice sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it. "I think about that night sometimes," he said. "The Gala. Do you know, the collector we moved the date up for never even ended up consigning anything with us. It came to nothing, in the end. And I keep thinking, if I'd known that ahead of time, if I'd known it wasn't going to matter the way we thought it would, I would have been in that room with you instead. But I didn't know, and I chose it anyway, and I think that's the part that eats at me now. Not that the collector's visit came to nothing. That I didn't even hesitate before choosing it over you. I didn't have a ready response for that. Some part of me had spent 7 years imagining what an apology from my father might sound like, and I don't think I'd ever actually pictured one this specific, this quietly devastating in its honesty. I told him I needed some time to think about everything, both the audit situation and everything underneath it, and he said that was fair, that he understood. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I believed he actually meant it rather than simply saying what he thought would keep me on the phone. "Can I ask you something else?" he said, before we hung up. "Does Nathaniel know you're the one whose firm is reviewing this? Does he understand how close we actually came to losing this deal entirely?" "I don't know what Nathaniel knows," I said honestly. "That's not really something I control anymore, Dad. I stopped managing what this family does or doesn't know about me a long time ago. It was the only way I knew how to survive it." He was quiet again, and then he said, "That's fair. I earned that." We hung up shortly after, and I sat at my kitchen table for a long time afterward, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel after that call. Not triumph, not vindication, just a tired, cautious kind of hope that maybe, for the first time in over 2 decades, my father had actually heard me. I spent the 2 days after that call turning it over and over with Julian at our kitchen table, the same table where, months earlier, I'd first told him about the engagement letter with my family's name on it, neither of us knowing then how directly it would eventually collide with my own life. Part of me, the same part that had once stood in a fluorescent hallway still quietly hoping someone would walk through the door, wanted desperately to find some way around the conflict, to somehow personally take over the audit and finally be the daughter who saved the family's biggest opportunity in a century. The future I'd once imagined for myself before I understood it had never actually been offered to me. Julian asked me the question I imagine by now sounds familiar if you've watched other stories on this channel, because it seems to sit underneath almost all of them. If you found a way to personally soften the findings and save the deal, what would actually change? Would your father ever fully reckon with what allowed those discrepancies to exist for years? Or would this just become the story he tells from now on? Clara came through for us, without ever having to sit with the fact that he only called once he needed something only you could give. I hated, again, that he was right. I told him so. He made me tea, the same quiet ritual he always turns to, and let me sit with it. So here is what I actually did. I called my father back 3 days later and told him, plainly, that I could not personally soften or influence the audit findings, but that I could, entirely outside any professional capacity, help him and Nathaniel understand what Margaret's report actually meant and what their real options were going forward. I told him I would sit with them over video call, on my own time, and walk through the findings honestly, because an honest understanding of the problem was worth infinitely more to them than a favorable-sounding report that couldn't survive real scrutiny. It took 3 video calls, each nearly 2 hours long, during which I watched my father, a man who had spent 33 years running consultations with confident, practiced ease, slowly absorb the actual scope of what Margaret's audit had found, a pattern of estate consignments, cumulative over nearly a decade, where valuations had been generously rounded upward, likely through a combination of genuine sentiment about long-standing client relationships and insufficient formal authentication protocols, rather than any deliberate intent to deceive. I watched Nathaniel, mostly silent through the first call, finally speak up during the second, admitting that he'd relied almost entirely on his own instinct and client relationships when pricing major pieces, never fully implementing the kind of formal authentication process our own family's founder had originally built the business's reputation on. I remember one moment from that second call especially clearly. Nathaniel sat at the same desk in the same office where, 20 years earlier, our father had introduced him around a room as the next generation of Ashwood and Bell, and he said quietly, almost like he didn't mean for it to come out loud, "I always assumed the relationships were the real value, that the technical stuff was something we could always sort out later if we needed to. I never really understood, until this audit, how much I was actually depending on you having done that work somewhere, even after you left. I don't think I ever consciously realized that until right now." I didn't have a perfect response to that. I just said, "Okay. Let's make sure the business is actually built on something that can hold up to real scrutiny going forward," and we kept working for almost 2 more hours, one finding at a time. Margaret's final report, entirely independent of anything I'd done, recommended a revised valuation approximately 18% below the family's original figure, along with a detailed corrective action plan for implementing formal authentication protocols going forward. The fund, presented with an honest, well-documented explanation rather than a defensive fight, agreed to proceed with the investment at the revised valuation, a deal that closed 6 weeks later, smaller than the family had originally hoped, but real, sustainable, and built on numbers that could actually withstand future scrutiny. I learned the details of that final negotiation secondhand from Margaret, since I'd formally recused myself from any direct involvement, and one detail she mentioned has stayed with me since. During the closing call, the fund's lead partner reportedly told Nathaniel that in nearly 15 years of conducting due diligence on family-owned collectible businesses, he had rarely seen a family respond to an unfavorable audit with this much transparency rather than resistance, and that this transparency, more than the revised numbers themselves, was ultimately what convinced the fund the business was actually worth investing in for the long term. I've thought about that comment often since. The idea that honesty, even costly honesty, can sometimes function as its own form of value, worth more over time than a number that only looks good until someone eventually checks it closely. About 2 weeks after the deal closed, Nathaniel called me for the first time in 7 years. I almost didn't recognize the number, the same area code I'd deleted from my phone sometime during the second year of silence, when deleting contacts had still felt, mistakenly, like it might make the whole situation easier to carry. Clara.
Hey.
It's me. His voice sounded exactly the way it had at 26, warm and easy. The voice of someone who had spent his whole life comfortable being the center of a room without quite realizing how much space that had required from everyone around him. Hi, Nathaniel. So, I don't really know how to say this properly, but thank you.
Genuinely.
I know you didn't have to walk us through any of that, and I know things have been complicated between us for a long time. I appreciated, honestly, that this call started differently than the ones I'd grown used to expecting from this family, an actual thank you, offered plainly, before any request followed it. I told him so. I appreciate you saying that, Nathaniel. I mean it. There was a pause, and then a little sheepishly he said, "Can I say something else? I used to think you were being a little precious about the technical side of things growing up. Like you were choosing to be difficult on purpose instead of just letting the relationships carry the business the way they always had. I don't think that anymore. I think I finally understand that the relationships were never actually the whole foundation. You were. I just never let myself really see that until an outside audit made me look at it honestly." I appreciate you saying that too, I told him and meant it. For what it's worth, I never resented your gift with people, Nathaniel. I think I resented how much easier it seemed to be loved for something visible and immediate than for something that only mattered when things quietly went wrong. That's not really your fault. That's just how our family was built long before either of us had any say in it. He was quiet for a moment and then, a little sheepishly, he said, "So, actually, since you clearly know this stuff better than anyone else we've ever worked with, I've been thinking about finally building out that formal authentication department you always wanted. Would you maybe be willing to help me figure out how to structure it? Even just casually, nothing official?" I can't formally consult on that, Nathaniel, for the same conflict reasons I explained to Dad, I told him honestly. But I can point you toward one of my senior colleagues who specializes exactly in this kind of ground-up authentication department design for growing auction and appraisal businesses. That's real, sustainable help, more valuable long-term than anything I could do quietly off the books. That's fair, he said, and I could hear, for the first time in the conversation, something that sounded like him actually accepting an answer instead of angling for a different one. For what it's worth, Clara, I think I spent most of my adult life assuming charm was the harder skill to build, since it seemed to come to me without much effort and technical knowledge was just something anyone could pick up eventually if they needed it. This whole process has made me realize how backwards that assumption actually was. I don't think I could have built what you built in 100 years, honestly. I just never let myself really sit with that until an outside audit forced me to. I didn't have a perfect response to that either. I told him I appreciated him saying it, and we hung up a few minutes later, both of us a little raw, both of us, for the first time in 7 years, cautiously willing to imagine a version of our relationship built on something sturdier than the roles our parents had assigned us as children. For months after the deal closed, my mother called, not texted, which by now you understand carries its own particular weight in my family, to ask, tentatively, whether I'd consider coming to Millbrook Falls for a visit. Not a full family gathering, just her and my father, at the house where I'd spent an entire summer at 15 learning to read dovetail joints under Mr. Delacroix's patient instruction. I said yes. I brought Julian. My father, a man who had never once in 33 years said the words, "I'm proud of you," to me directly, stood in front of the original auction house storefront when we arrived, looked at the two of us stepping out of the car, and said, quietly, in a voice that sounded like he was testing whether the words would actually hold, "You saved this business, Clara, in every way that actually matters. And I never once made room for you to be the one who could. I've had a long time to sit with that these last few months, and I don't have a good excuse for it. I just have an apology, if you're willing to hear it." We walked through the original gallery together before heading to the back office, and I noticed, for the first time in years, small changes that told their own quiet story. A new formal authentication protocol posted on the wall near the intake desk, a training binder sitting open on Nathaniel's desk where a stack of unfiled paperwork used to live, an old brooch, the very one I'd identified at 16, now displayed in a small glass case near the entrance, with a placard crediting the original. Discovery to me by name, something I hadn't known my mother had quietly arranged sometime in the past few months. I stood in front of that case for a long moment, reading my own name on a small brass plate, feeling something in me that had been braced for disappointment for nearly 2 decades slowly, cautiously, begin to loosen. We spent that afternoon in the small back office where I used to study under Mr. Delacroix as a girl, and at one point, my mother brought out an old folder she said she'd been meaning to give me for years and never quite found the courage to. Inside were newspaper clippings I'd never known existed, a small regional business journal feature about the brooch discovery, my certification exam results, a photograph from that summer at 15, me hunched over a desk with Mr. Delacroix beside me, both of us focused entirely on the piece in front of us. "I kept these," my mother said, a little unsteadily, "even when I didn't know how to actually tell you they mattered. I think some part of me always knew we were getting this wrong. I just didn't have the courage to say, so while it might have still changed something. I did not cry in front of them. I saved that for the drive home, somewhere along the quiet New England roads, Julian's hand resting quietly on my knee, not saying a word, just letting me have it, the way he always has. For months after the deal closed, my mother called, not texted, which by now you understand carries its own particular weight in my family, to ask, tentatively, whether I'd consider coming to Millbrook Falls for a visit. Not a full family gathering, just her and my father, at the house where I'd spent an entire summer at 15 learning to read dovetail joints under Mr. Delacroix's patient instruction. I said yes. I brought Julian. My father, a man who had never once in 33 years said the words, "I'm proud of you," to me directly, stood in front of the original auction house storefront when we arrived, looked at the two of us stepping out of the car, and said, quietly, in a voice that sounded like he was testing whether the words would actually hold, "You saved this business, Clara, in every way that actually matters. And I never once made room for you to be the one who could. I've had a long time to sit with that these last few months, and I don't have a good excuse for it. I just have an apology, if you're willing to hear it." We walked through the original gallery together before heading to the back office, and I noticed, for the first time in years, small changes that told their own quiet story. A new formal authentication protocol posted on the wall near the intake desk, a training binder sitting open on Nathaniel's desk where a stack of unfiled paperwork used to live, an old brooch, the very one I'd identified at 16, now displayed in a small glass case near the entrance, with a placard crediting the original. Discovery to me by name, something I hadn't known my mother had quietly arranged sometime in the past few months. I stood in front of that case for a long moment, reading my own name on a small brass plate, feeling something in me that had been braced for disappointment for nearly 2 decades slowly, cautiously, begin to loosen. We spent that afternoon in the small back office where I used to study under Mr. Delacroix as a girl, and at one point, my mother brought out an old folder she said she'd been meaning to give me for years and never quite found the courage to. Inside were newspaper clippings I'd never known existed, a small regional business journal feature about the brooch discovery, my certification exam results, a photograph from that summer at 15, me hunched over a desk with Mr. Delacroix beside me, both of us focused entirely on the piece in front of us. I kept these, my mother said, a little unsteadily. Even when I didn't know how to actually tell you they mattered. I think some part of me always knew we were getting this wrong. I just didn't have the courage to say, so while it might have still changed something. I did not cry in front of them. I saved that for the drive home, somewhere along the quiet New England roads, Julian's hand resting quietly on my knee, not saying a word, just letting me have it, the way he always has. What this was, in the end, was a moment where the family that had never once fully valued my expertise needed something only that exact expertise could actually help solve, and I got to choose clearly and completely what kind of help that would be. Not a rescue built on bending my own standards. Not a reward for finally being noticed. Just fair, rigorous, honest guidance. The same guidance I would have given any stranger who came to me with the same crisis, offered with boundaries a stranger would never have needed from me, because a stranger never once introduced a room to my younger brother as the next generation, while I stood quietly a few feet away, having already proven, at 13 years old, exactly what I was capable of. Nathaniel and I talk more now, tentatively, still learning the shape of a relationship neither of us was ever taught how to build, exchanging the occasional message about nothing in particular, the small, unglamorous groundwork of a sibling relationship built on something other than comparison. My parents and I speak most weeks. It is not the future I imagined at 15, hunched over a desk with Mr. Delacroix, hoping someone in my family would find what I loved as worth celebrating as what Nathaniel loved. But it is real, and it is honest, and it is finally built on something sturdier than an inherited assumption about which siblings' gift mattered more in front of a client. In the end, I think that's worth more than any business my parents could have handed me outright. I still think, sometimes, about that engagement letter, about the strange, quiet lurch of seeing my own family's name on it and understanding, in that moment, that I held influence over the single largest financial decision in my family's history before they'd even fully grasped what was actually at stake themselves. I think about how easy it would have been to do nothing, to let Margaret's audit run its course without ever picking up the phone, to call it even after everything. And I think about how choosing to help instead, but helping entirely on my own terms, within my own integrity, without ever once compromising the rigor and honesty my whole career had been built on, turned out to be the far more powerful choice, both for them and, just as importantly, for me. That choice, not the deal, not even the folder of saved clippings that came after, that was the real ending to the story. Everything else was simply what happened once I finally let myself believe I was allowed to make it. That's the whole story. Thank you for staying with me through all of it. If any part of this reminded you of your own family, your own quieter kind of gift nobody quite knew how to celebrate, your own decision to build something extraordinary somewhere else entirely, I hope you know what took me nearly 20 years to learn. The people who overlook your expertise don't get the final say on what you're worth. You get to decide that. Quietly and completely, on your own terms, in your own time, without anyone else's permission required. It is one of the hardest lessons a family can teach you without ever meaning to, and one of the most valuable ones to finally fully learn. If you made it this far, tell me in the comments, would you have taken the engagement or walked away for good? I read every single one, and these conversations have become one of the most meaningful parts of telling these stories. Reminder that so many of you have lived some version of what it feels like to be the quieter, less celebrated sibling in your own family, and that this channel has become, in its own small way, a place where that experience finally gets named out loud. I'll see you in the next one.